Ndodhemi në hamamin historik në qytetin e Prizrenit në kuadër të Dokufestit, kur Rubikoni KTV-s bashku me Dokufestin organizojnë këtë debat të hapur lidhur me ballafaqimin me të kaluarën. Pra, ku janë shtetet e ish-Jugosllavisë në procesin e ballafaqimit me të kaluarën, cila është marrëdhënia me kujtesën, cilat janë viktimat dhe si ndjen ata në stadion që ndodhemi tash Kosova 14 vjet pas lufte, kurse Bosna, Kroacia dhe shtetet e tjera edhe më tepër, dhe si ndikojnë proceset politike që vazhdojnë ndërmjet këtyre shteteve dhe marrëdhëniet e tyre në procesin e përgjithshëm të ripajtimit. Për diskutuar lidhur me këtë temë kam 3 mysafir të njohur dhe të nderuar, duke filluar nga zonja Nataša Kandić, një aktiviste e njohur të drejtave të njerëzit, themeluese e Fondit për Drejtën Humanitare, fituese shumë shpërblimeve për drejtat të njerëzit. Nga Zagrebi vjen filozofi i njohur, profesori Žarko Puhovski, po ashtu i përfshirë në iniciativën të shumta të ripajtimit dhe ballafaqimit me të kaluarën, si dhe publicisti, themeluesi i shtëpisë mediale Koha, politikani, aktivisti i drejtave të njerëzit, zoti Veton Surroi, i cili natyrisht është edhe më i njohur për shikuesit ton. Mr. Puhovski, we're going to start with you. Welcome, first of all. It's nice having you here after 50 years in Pristina, around some. You've been during the 60s. So where do we stand? We know that different countries that came after the breakup of Yugoslavia are in different states of dealing with one another. For example, we are in Kosovo, where is an ongoing negotiation between the 2 prime ministers, and still Serbia did not recognize Kosovo. This is something totally different compared to a relationship of other countries who have finished with this chapter of recognizing one another, but they are dealing with the truth of what happened during the war and who did what. How do you see this situation?
As usual in politics, we have a kind of process. We all have to be happy that the process has started, but we can't know when and how the process is going to finish. We can expect a kind of end solution, which is more or less obvious, but it's very important to know when, how, and what are going to be the costs for this solution. The real analysis in politics always has to take costs in the account. Not only the access to the process or the success, but really what had to be paid, sometimes in human life, sometimes in money, or in territory. Something's going to be paid for this success, and that's the problem. We don't know what.
Other countries didn't have this problem. For example, we have Montenegro that has more Serbs than Kosovo has. And still we have the negotiation about Serbia not wanting to accept what Kosovo or Kosovo Albanians call reality of independence Kosovo. Is this harming the process?
First of all, there is reality called Kosovo. There is no doubt about it. But politics has thousands of years of experience in denying reality. You have had, for instance, in German relations between East and Western Germany, so-called Hallstein Doctrine, for 25 years, when Western Germany was refusing the acceptance, the countries that would be ready to accept the existence of Eastern Germany and so on. And even Western Germany, which was much stronger than Serbia ever could be, had to stop with this politics. So Serbia is going to be, again, on the losing side, and they know it. The problem is, again, how can they sell it to their own population? And on the other hand, how can they sell it to the Brussels? What are going to be the, let's say, gifts given to them from Brussels in return for, quote-unquote, generous acceptance of reality called Kosovo? And that's almost always the political game. We have had this with Croatia. We still have it with Bosnia and Herzegovina. We still have it with Macedonia. We still have open questions in post-Yugoslav countries, not to mention, I don't know, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Nagorno-Karabakh, or Georgia, and so on. So there are at least dozens of such problems only in this part of Europe or Caucasus, not to mention other parts of it. A very important thing is, especially for people in Kosovo, to understand that this is not a unique case. All the nationalists are ready to believe that their case is unique. It's not. And that has to be understood, and therefore we can learn from the way the others were dealing with not the same, but quite similar problems.
Can we say that it's going harder with Albanians and Serbs than it was with Serbs and Croats, or Serbs and Montenegrins who as well declared their independence?
Relations between Serbs and Albanians are completely different than past of between Serbs and Croats or Serbs and Muslims. We have situation lasted more than 20 years with human rights violations here in Kosovo, without any relations between Serbs and Albanians, and with a specific approach of Serbian government, without any attempt to change relations with Albanians. It was not only discrimination, it was really repression many years. But now I think that we have some improvement. And the first time after Milosevic, I see that Kosovo is on the same level as Serbia. We have talking, sometimes somebody say negotiation, on equal level, Prime Minister of Kosovo and Prime Minister of Serbia, and the feeling of ordinary people is different. They feel better. They see that their Prime Minister is not called war criminals, that Serbian media say different, they say Prime Minister of Kosovo. It's not important what we think about Prime Minister of Kosovo or Prime Minister of Serbia, but the language is different, and I think it is important. It's a precondition for some other relations, and at the moment everything depends of normalization of between Serbia and Kosovo institution, and once is not so far, we can expect more than only normalization between institution, and we can expect starting process of dealing with past. Those processes will be completely different than between Serbs and Croats and Serbs and Muslims, because everything what's happened in Kosovo, it was has the name. Serbian police, Serbian army, everything is in possession of Serbian authority. They know what's happened. But to start to speak about that requires different relations between institutions.
This process of normalization is sometimes understood differently in Belgrade and differently in Pristina. In Pristina, for example, it is seen that a way that Serbia is trying again to escape the formal recognition and the finishing of job with Kosovo to have full normalization of relationship by recognizing the new state, in order to have some maybe change of geopolitics for later when they can deal differently. And in Belgrade as well, they are trying to see this as an opportunity to go near the EU and without doing the final step of recognizing Kosovo. So this again brings some turbulences within the communities.
Kosovo became independent in June in 1999 after war crimes. But de jure now, Serbia accepted, Kosovo legal and political system, and we can say that it's some kind of formal recognition. But you, as Albanians, you can ask for more public, formal, de jure recognition. But in my opinion, for the beginning, it's a very important step. You know, what means if Serbian government accepted that court in Mitrovica will be the part of Kosovo judiciary system. But it's completely clear that court in Mitrovica with Serbian judges and prosecutors will be part of Kosovo judiciary system. It is a part of de jure recognition of Kosovo legal system. And to expect from this government you know, to organize a meeting of Serbian parliament and to tell, yes, now we are going to recognize, I don't know, Kosovo as a state is too much at the moment. You know, it's the government who trying after 13 years to change relations with Kosovo, and in very short time I see very good steps forward. And in my opinion, you know, I'm speaking from a human rights point, and I think it's very important to start to speak about mass graves, about what's happened in the past, and you know, to try to improve life of families of killed and missing, and life of ordinary people.
Mr. Surroi, you were a participant in many rounds of negotiations in the past between Kosovo and Serbia and international community. This time, with this ongoing dialogue, you are critical and you have your reserves. We heard the previous speakers, what they have to say about this dialogue and how it affects reconciliation and dealing with the past process. What is your point of view?
Let me introduce into the debate three concepts which I think both Žarko and Nataša have in one or the other way have touched upon. But let me try to put them in my language, in the way I understand it. The first one is, we are speaking of an unfinished state. So a state building process is not finished in Kosovo. And this in itself presents weak institutions of the state that need to handle too many things at the same time, and dealing with the past may not be an immediate priority. And this is one of the handicaps of this and all the other processes, is that they have not focused on basically getting to a point in which the state building process is, or the hardware is more or less there, is set. The second problem that derives from this is that the past is not over yet. And because you are continuously building, there's something always coming from the past and introducing itself in the present. And this is a continuous problem for a weak and unfinished state, because it needs to continuously address the past without the institutions to do so, or the political climate to do so. And the third is that there is a continuous competition between the past and the present. Namely, just take the question of crimes. Many people here would like to address not the war crimes, but actually the economic crimes or the corruption. And sometimes the perpetrators are the same. Sometimes they come from the same background, or to a great extent, the criminalized group that basically heads the government today may be responsible for one thing. It may be also responsible to a great and a visible extent for economic crimes. And the attention of the population in such conditions may actually, in an unfinished conflict, in an unfinished state, will say, you know, don't deal with war crimes. Get them for the money they have stolen. Leave these issues for later. So basically I want to repackage what I think I've understood, which is we are heading into a situation in which we will be dealing with these issues in probably more difficult conditions than the other republics in ex-Yugoslavia.
Not only that Kosovo is an unfinished state, but Serbia as well. And Serbia was first in this part of the world that had a modern state back in 19th century. And now, after 150 years, no one knows where are the borders of Serbia. They don't know who are the citizens of Serbia. They don't know how many Montenegrinians are citizens of Serbia, vice versa. Some number of persons from Kosovo have right to be Serbian citizens, and no one knows what's the number. They don't know the border, and they don't know the population. These are two basic elements of a definition of every state. Kosovo has a very clear excuse. It's a new state. Serbia is not. But they had, 10 days ago, finally finished with last Yugoslav symbols. It was YAT, Yugoslav Air Transport, and Tanjug, which was the news agency. Both had still Yugoslav names. And that's kind of problem. On the other hand, there is a very old tradition of relations which are different. I'm coming back to the question for Nataša, between Serbs and Croats. For Serbian nationalists, Croats were always enemies, more or less on equal basis. Albanians were servants. Albanians were not enemies for Serbian nationalists, they were servants. And that's the problem in psychology. They can even accept to be beaten by Croats, because Croats are more or less playing in the same league, to use this formula. Albanians were understood as a group of people, not even a nation in modern terms, way above. There are 3 leagues down there. And now they have to accept they are losing not only against the Albanians, but also some very important parts of Serbian historical background. And this is the shock for the Serbian nationalism. Much bigger than losing parts of Serbian territories in Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina and so on and so on. Well, Bosnia will see whether they are losing or not, but in Croatia they have lost parts of the territory in which Serbian population was living for more than 3.5 centuries, which is again something that's a historical fact. And then they act now in my opinion, a very wrong way. In a way, they are now, the international community, repeating mistakes done in Croatia in 91. When the war started in 91, everyone talked about the rights of Serbs in Knin and the Croats in Zagreb. And the real problem were the rights of Croats in Knin and the Serbs in Zagreb. Now everyone is talking about the rights of Serbs in Mitrovica and Albanians in Pristina or Prizren, and not vice versa, and that's the real problem. The minority is always the problem. The territorialization of ethnic rights or collective rights makes no difference. It only changes the position of minority or majority. Former majority is now minority and vice versa, but the problem is still there. And that's why the solution with Northern Mitrovica cannot have any bearing for the future, let's say, general solution in this area. And this is, Veton was absolutely right in saying so, a consequence of a very unpleasant relation between two unfinished states, with, in my opinion, incompetent leaders on both sides. I'm not a politician, I can say this.
What is there to be done to accelerate this process that we are seeing is accepted in different realities from both sides?
In my understanding, I was worried many years, looking what's happened in Serbia, what's happened in Kosovo, humiliation at the border, and for me, when I see that some people feel better, that if I see less discriminations, I think it is better. And if we have some development, it's easier to think how to improve further. And at the moment, people in Kosovo, they don't believe in this process of talking between Serbia and Montenegro, Serbia and Kosovo. But citizens of Serbia, I think Serbs, they're fed up with Kosovo. Serbs from Kosovo who are in Serbia, they are surprised. They are very quiet at the moment because, they were supported very much by the former government in their, political approach, always accusing Albanians, always calling Albanians a terrorist who killed Serbs, who killed all Serbs. But now they are very quiet. They are surprised that their old friends now are different, completely different than their expectation. They, can you imagine that current president of Serbia said yesterday that that he as president of Serbia will not invite will not invite Serbs to boycott elections. It is the first time, because in the time of democratic leader Boris Tadić, the Serbian government invited Serbs, in a different way. Their advice was not to participate in elections. Now it's different. And we should respect changes, some new approach. And if we continue, to criticize, but I think that this process is not easy. After 13 years to expect a new, democratic North Mitrovica, North Kosovo is too much. But I also see some changes, Before two months, all Serbs leader from North Mitrovica, they were, very strong against. But now they are not so the same as before. And it's small step, but step. And I believe that we started with a process who will continue with changes. With some elements of our life.
But when we are describing this process as you are we talking about different phases or stages of the process? So before they didn't want to talk, or they organized, Belgrade organized elections, Serbian elections in the territory of Kosovo. Now they say that local Serbs have to engage in political, social and institutional life in Kosovo, but there is another stage now, because they are still keeping some of the elements to put blockades for Kosovo citizens. For example, let's talk about athletes who cannot compete in international leagues and so on. So still Serbia wants to keep a generation of Albanians living in a ghetto, and this is the same Serbia that was waging war 14 years ago against this same nation or people, and still is trying to do what Belgrade can to make life not normal for citizens of Kosovo.
I understand you that you would like, and as probably people in Kosovo, to see tomorrow political will of the Serbian government to say, yes, Kosovo is an independent state and will support Kosovo in asking a seat in the United Nations. I think that the new government is not easy for them. When I think about the Serbian president, I'm always wondering what's happened in his mind. It could could be confusion in his mind, what is his past? And now he say he's sitting behind the Kosovo president of Atifete Yahyaga, and I think sometimes he doesn't know what's happened with reality. What is reality? Alexander Vučić is different, and he has the energy more than previous president of Serbia he would like. But of course, I cannot forget his past. But sometimes in history it's very important to support process who will bring some better in the life of ordinary people, who will change, who will stop discrimination. And, I think that, Serbs were never in position to discriminate Croats, but always in situation in position to discriminate Albanians. And now I hope it is end of those political life of Serbia. And we as civil society, now we are in position to support everything what is doing with this government if they intend to take our job. And they say, now some extremist political groups in Serbia called Vučić and Dačić as traitor. It's new element. It's good if they are traitors. Sometimes I remember 2008 when Dačić called me, she's traitor, she should be arrested. Now he's traitor, and I think it's good development.
Mr. Surroi, I would ask you to comment on what Ms. Kandić just said. So we have same politicians, same people who were waging war or being spokespersons as is Prime Minister of Serbia, Ivica Dačić, now of Slobodan Milošević, and now we are seeing a change?
Well, there are two things. The first one is we are looking at it from different angles, and Nataša is saying things are moving and let's support things that are moving. What I'm saying is that they're not moving sufficiently enough. They're not moving to the direction that we would want them to move and as fast as we would like them to move. And once things do not move in their necessary speed, things might get difficult. And let me give you an example. In minority rights, Kosovo has probably the most advanced legal system in Europe. We've negotiated this throughout the Vienna process. The basic notion of these minority rights is that they should not be territorial, which means that everybody should be protected regardless of where he or she lives, and whether he or she is in a minority position in an overwhelming majority or not. It's irrelevant. So a non-territorial approach has now been added with a territorial approach. And the expansion of a legal system, a constitution, can be done in a natural way in which people naturally develop it. But it cannot be done in such a way, you cannot patch things in the legal system. You cannot say, I take this part and introduce it, and I take this part and introduce it. Especially two not very brilliant people such as Mr. Dačić and Mr. Thaci in their knowledge of neither minority rights or many other things that are rights. And once you develop that kind of system, you may overstretch. And the result is not more rights, but less rights, because you cannot implement those rights, because you don't have a system to implement those rights. What we would have needed in these negotiations is a situation in which maybe Serbia not recognizing Kosovo, but the Serbian authority recognizing the entity as such and its right to participate in an international environment regardless of status. So instead of the status-neutral formula that they have adopted, there could have been a more advanced formula, such as the German-German Accord, that actually allowed East Germany and West Germany to respect each other's statehoods, despite the objections that Western Germany had over East Germany and vice versa. So this is the first aspect. The second aspect is that the situation here and the situation in Belgrade has never been better for such an accord because of the preconditions that were needed for Serbia in terms of accession. I remember when Vučić and Nikolić were elected, the first association with serious diplomats was that we're going to get a Nixon to China approach. So these would be the right-wingers who would be naturally inclined to go in such an anti-direction and never be accused for it. Well, Nixon to China was insufficient in the Dačić, Nikolić, Vučić approach. And Mr. Thaci and Mr. Dačić may actually have enjoyed each other's company, and that is good. But that is insufficient for both of our states. And this is the point that I want to make. You know, we cannot spend our lives educating people to come to a point 15 years later. We cannot spend, Mr. Thaci and Mr. Dačić are now speaking what Nataša was saying 14 or 15 years ago. Now, what do we need to go through in the next 15 years so they get to a point in saying, wait a minute, we need to normalize entirely our relations. We need to be fairly legal, functional states. We cannot afford for our kids to be these unfinished states that with wobbly political and legal systems that get patched every so many years because somebody doesn't have any other thing to do in Brussels. And mind you, the greatest success of the foreign policy of the European Union in the past 3 or 4 years has been actually getting Mr. Dačić and Mr. Thaci together and making their mutual life enjoyable.
If you have anything to add before I open the floor for questions or remarks, please, whoever wants to make a comment, question, introduce yourself, microphone. You're going to break the ice. Microphone, please.
Thank you, Adriatic. My name is Haki Avazi and I represent the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, which is very involved with the dealing with the past and truth-finding in the region. I could not resist to make a remark about what is the precondition of this endless historical process of never actually dealing with the past. And I think it would be not smart to go deep into the history, but at least trying to deal properly with the recent history and the missing persons. I think one of the indicators that shows that there's no political will to do anything but preserve the positions of before war in the Balkans is that there is no even that genuine willingness to deal with the issue of the missing persons. Unfortunately, we have thousands still in Bosnia, in Kosovo, in Croatia, and I think until we see that moving forward, we can see processes that we don't know where they're going to end up, but I think what we see clearly is that there is no changing mindset in the region on how the future should look like in terms of really being open and sincere, at least at the level of human lives and families who live in situations of not knowing where their beloved ones are. The other aspect I wanted to talk here from what three panelists were referring to is the idea of a Nobel Peace Prize for Cathy Ashton, Dačić, and Thaci. I think this would be a nail on the coffin of a system of values in the Balkans by recognizing the criminals to be, in a way, transforming themselves into the peacemakers, and encouragement for the processes around the world that you can actually wage the war and use all the methods around the world in killing thousands, but eventually you're going to get the Nobel Peace Prize if you come around and try to be a good guy in order to buy the peace and the freedom for yourself, which I think it's something that this region really needs to discuss about, because we owe to the rest of the world, like conflicts in Syria and other parts of the world, and what kind of encouragement of peace and transformation of conflict we're actually reflecting in the world. And maybe the third and very kind of critical in this analysis is about the political elites that very often remain in power or recycle themselves in the Balkans as a result of agendas that are not necessarily driven by the people's needs in the region. And we have seen this. Unfortunately, I know there are many people here who are not from the region and not even from Kosovo, and might be too sensitive topic. But I think just realizing 13 years in Kosovo with 45% unemployment, 20% of extreme poverty, and every single airplane that flies into Kosovo is 80% by international consultants who come here and have consultancy overly paid and everything else, it just tells you that this is actually a conflict that recycles itself, and the equation really almost doesn't have people into the calculation. I think within my comment, I think the missing person, it's a big question that anyone who claims to be an activist and fighting for the human rights and transforming this conflict into something that could be a developmental kind of challenge should reflect on the idea that we need to bring peace to these families and the communities in order to be talking about reconciliation and facing the past.
Relating the missing persons, it is a political issue. Now, the last example is clear. Serbian government supported exhumation in Croatia, discovering information about one mass grave. It means that, you know, that current governments, their institutions have information about mass graves, about the fate of missing persons. Everywhere in the region, the number of missing persons is the same the last few years. It means that there are no political will to give information about mass graves. The number of missing persons in Kosovo is 1,700. 1,300 Albanians and 400 non-Albanians, Serbs, Roma and others. And there are no not political will. There are no. It's not issue of on political agenda. You know, victims, families of association, they have sometimes very strange requests. You know, they say, no, we will not allow talking in Brussels without knowing what's happened with missing persons. And of course, it doesn't have any political impact. But now it's time, you know, to address those issues. But the problem is that, you know, majority of population in Kosovo and in Serbia, they are occupied with other problems. You know, families of missing persons, they are alone without strong civil society support. And European Union also and Brussels doesn't have clear strategy relating missing persons, relating the transitional justice and especially missing persons. There are no strategy.
Two things. Last, German prisoners of war came back from Russia or Soviet Union in spring 1966, 21 years after the end of the war. And these were the states much better organized than Croatia or Serbia or Kosovo or ever be. So this is something that takes a period for political reasons, as Nataša has said already. Second, as to Nobel Prize, small wonder. After Vietnamese totalitarian leadership and Kissinger were given a Nobel Prize, after Jewish and Palestinian terrorists were given a Nobel Prize, after the biggest scandal ever that Obama, who hasn't done anything for peace but a lot for war, was given a Nobel Prize, you cannot be shocked. It's a logical continuation of the same politics. I mean, after Obama was given a Nobel Prize for peace, that would be the same as a young student would be given a Nobel Prize for physics after he promised to develop a new method for I don't know what. And then suddenly start doing whatever he can or she can against the scientific principles. And no one protested. So why should they protest now when finally someone from this part maybe could be a candidate? They are not as bad guys as Obama is, as Israeli leadership is, or no. They have killed much less people than Obama. And they didn't have a direct transmission of a killing of an unarmed person, which is one of the worst things ever a head of state has done in history. I mean, we have to be objective. You cannot employ one criteria for local guys here and another criteria in Washington or London or Moscow. I mean, let's try to be objective. So it's a logical thing, in my opinion.
Other questions, comments? Please.
My name is Robbie, and I come from Israel. And I'm part of a group called the Parents Circle. And we are Palestinian and Israelis who've lost children and who work for reconciliation. And I'm originally from South Africa. And I'm listening to the thought of missing persons, and the first thing that occurs to me is that there has to be amnesty. If you don't dangle the flag of amnesty somewhere along the line, you will never find out where those people are, as painful and as hurtful as that is. And if you look into the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you will recognize that that was really why they did it. There was nothing to do with forgiving. It was nothing to do with reconciliation even, because there was no recompense or people didn't really benefit from it, but there would have been a bloodbath. So maybe you're in need of a reconciliation process which will give amnesty, which is really difficult. It's like the battle that we are having now with releasing of prisoners. If Israel doesn't recognize the needs of the Palestinian people to release prisoners, then they can negotiate as much as they like in Washington and nothing will happen. Because actually the prisoners for the Palestinian people are just as important as land or East Jerusalem or anything else. So that is the practicalities and the pragmatism that needs to happen. And all the emotions, as painful as it is as a mother who lost her child, I recognize that this is what has to happen.
Ms. Kandić.
In our situation...
ProCredit Bank me verzionin më të ri i banking ju mundëson të paguani tatimet, kontributet pensionale, faturat mujore, shpejt e lehtë nga kompjuteri juaj.
Në ishte njëherë një kopsht magjik ku rrobat e lara lulzonin si lule magnole.
Prit, nuk ka magji. Është thjesht prestia e Bonux Magnolia.
Bonux Magnolia, lërini rrobat tuaja të lulzojnë me aromën e magnolave.
Nëse jeni të prekupuar se në cilin institucion të arsimit të lartë të studioni, mos hezitoni. Dardania ju ofron 10 vite dije dhe ardhmëri, reformë dhe risi. Merrni pjesë në festimet të 10 vjetorit të Dardanisë që të mësoni për planet dhe ambicjet e saj. 3 janë ngjarjet në të cilat ju ftojmë për të festuar me ne. Më 27 shtator nga ora 11 deri në orën 15 vendosin e gur themelit të objektit të ri. Konferencën për 10 vjetorin e Dardanisë dhe promovimin e kompletit të veprave të akademik e Sat Stavilecit. 3 ngjarje që shënojnë një jubile që kultivon një tradit që pretendon të bëhet pjesë e jetës suaj. Një jetë juaj e pasur. Ftesat merren në administratën e Kolegjit Dardania. Ju mirëpresim.
Bërnica Park nga Chelsea Point, projekti mahnitshëm me 70 shtëpi dhe 18 apartamente me dizajn të stilit anglez. Për më shumë informata ju lutem na kontaktoni apo na vizitoni online në www.chelseapoint.net.
Croissant i ri 7 Days Max. Croissant 7 Days. tani edhe më i madh dhe më i shkripët, me brum më të butë dhe plot mbushje kakao. E re, 7 Days Max me kakao dhe 7 Days Double Max kakao dhe vanilje. 7 Days Max, për kënaqësi maksimale.
Rruga më e lehtë për të pastruar tualetën me 4 mënyra.
Bref Power Active. Efekti Veton me 4 mënyra. Fuqi pastruese, fuqi shkumuese, kundër gërqedhës dhe ekstra pastërti.
Gjithmonë pastër dhe freskët.
Bref Power Active.
Henkel.
Lunch is over, so this is over.
Wait, is this a breakup?
Don't make this any harder.
But
Jepini fund mbetjeve ushqimore, për dhëmbë të pastër dhe të shëndetshëm. Happy për Trip Orbit.
Çfarë është komode dhe e përsosur teksilani i ri? Të zgjoheni në një shtrat të butë dhe të freskët, kjo është ratje e përsosur. Dhe të shijoni këtë ndjenjë të butësisë dhe freskisë deri në mbrëmje. Kjo është më të vërtet ratje e përsosur. Silan Perfect Comfort i ri, ndjeje rahatin e përsosur.
Rexona bën më tepër për ju, që të jeni edhe më aktive. Vetëm Rexona ka motion sense që aktivizohet me çdo lëvizje që bëni. Sa më shumë lëvizni, aq më shumë ju mbron. Bëhu aktive. Rexona nuk të shgënjen.
Rimbushja motorit me vaj? Nuk është problem. Oh jo, kjo është një njollë që largohet në temperaturë të lartë, por kjo bluzë mund të lahet vetëm në temperaturë të ulët.
Kjo na frymëzoi për të krijuar të riun Persil Expert. Tashmë në 20 gradë, kapsulat e fuqishme largojnë njollat edhe më rezistente për një pastërti të përsosur. Rikthen shkëlqimin. Wow! I ri Persil Expert, asgjë nuk është më i fortë.
Nëse jeni të preokupuar se në cilin institucion të arsimit të lartë të studioni, mos hezitoni. Dardania ju ofron 10 vite dije dhe ardhmëri, reformë dhe risi. Merrni pjesë në festimet të 10 vjetorit të Dardanisë që të mësoni për planet dhe ambicjet e saj. 3 janë ngjarjet në të cilat ju ftojmë për të festuar me ne. Më 27 shtator nga ora 11 deri në orën 15 vendosin e gur themelit të objektit të ri. Konferencën për 10 vjetorin e Dardanisë dhe promovimin e kompletit të veprave të akademik e Sat Stavilecit. 3 ngjarje që një jubile që kultivon një tradit që pretendon të bëhet pjesë e jetës suaj. Një jetë juaj e pasur. Ftesat merren në administratën e Kolegjit Dardania. Ju mirëpresim.
ProCredit Bank me verzionin më të ri i banking ju mundëson të paguani tatimet, kontributet pensionale, faturat mujore, shpejt e lehtë nga kompjuteri juaj.
Child, I recognize that this is what has to happen.
Our situation in post-Yugoslav countries is different than South Africa experience. We have war crimes trials, and to give amnesty for war crimes is impossible. Probably for some crimes, it's possible to start to talk about to people to accept responsibility, but with criminal justice, amnesty is not a good approach. And for example, family of victims in Bosnia, they're against amnesty. Families in Kosovo also are against amnesty. For them, criminal trials are very important, but now some of them are disappointed with the Hague Tribunal. But in our situation, criminal justice is very important. We have a civil society idea about regional commission who will establish facts about the war crimes, about all victims, and to name perpetrators. And we have different opinion about that. Some people think that it is very good idea to have regional approach in this process of reconciliation, and also different opinion what means reconciliation. For example, some of us, we think that to name all victims, to establish facts about the war crimes is very important, to break our Balkan culture, always memory relating the number of victims, never with names. But amnesty is a very sensitive issue, and when we discussed about regional approach, families of missing persons, some of them say, for maybe to give some kind of amnesty to perpetrators who are ready to discover location of mass graves. But based on a law in Bosnia and Serbia, it's impossible to tell. No, he will be released if he give to families or to prosecutor office some information. Personally, I believe that regional approach can open space for people who have information about the mass graves to tell and to support. And but in our case, probably some families will never be in situation to give remains of their members of family because in our post-Yugoslav wars, police and army used to destroy evidence about the war crimes, burning remains. And some families will be in very difficult situation, but the issue of amnesty is against our main approach that criminal justice is very important, that war criminals should be publicly or legally responsible for what they did.
I don't believe that this job.
I don't think anybody anywhere believes that all the perpetrators will be caught, sentenced. But I think everybody believes that there should not be an amnesia. There should not be an amnesia. And I think the tendency of societies who do not deal with their past, one or the other way, is actually to hope that collective amnesia will solve the problem. That everybody will soon forget. And because there's a human need to forget. There's a human need to forget violence, and there's a human need to leave behind some of the unpleasant things that one has lived through. There's a hope in some of these societies, or some of these regimes, or some of these leaders, that in 10, 20 years, things will be forgotten. And once they have been forgotten, that then peace can be achieved. And I think Nataša is a very valuable person for many years for human rights. And her approach has been actually not amnesia, but let us confront every single person with that reality. Let us identify our past. Let us identify it and document it and leave it there for future use. Because one of the problems of amnesia, and in the 100 years we have gone from one generation to the other, recycling wars and recycling hatreds. And I think time has come that needs to be stopped. And that needs to be stopped exactly when we identify war as such and the products of war as such.
Thank you. My name is Doris Mano. I'm a master's student in Balkan Studies. My question goes to Mr. Surroi. You mentioned that the leaders of Serbia and Kosovo have to take a much more radical approach and to decide to achieve full normalization of relations. But we all know that for this they need the support of their political constituencies. So my question is, what does media in Kosovo as an opinion-shaping institution do in order to transform the minds of the people in the same way that the mind of Mr. Nikolic was transformed over the years? Because I find it outrageous that despite all the training in objective reporting that the media in the region had, we still have selective reporting on isolated incidents of violence, for example, on the Serb returnees in Kosovo or on in some villages, Albanian villages in the north. And this is preventing, actually undermining trust and preventing reconciliation in the short term. Thanks.
You know, I would not take the textbook approach by which politicians build support and then they take decisive action. And certainly this is not the case neither in Serbia nor in Kosovo. Neither of these leaders have actually garnered democratic support for any of their actions and conducted. If one wants to extend this theory even further, rarely you will find political leaders actually reading the polls every single day and taking decisions based on those polls. It's something that I think President Clinton had initiated, this reading of public support. And taking action which is not very popular with the public support, the Kosovo War being one example. But the question that I put to the politicians in Belgrade, in Pristina, and to those who are mediating in Brussels, is how is it possible that a government in Kosovo takes many measures without not a consultation with the people, but without consulting the parliament? You know, they make decisions on many things. How is it possible that they can take these decisions, especially those that may contribute to their personal well-being and increasing their bank balances? But how is it possible that they take these measures without consulting? How is it possible that in Belgrade people can take very decisive measures without consulting the parliament or the public? And it is not possible for them to achieve a situation in which they can actually make a quantum leap. Now, the question is not about the popular support. The question is about leadership. And Žarko, I think, has defined the quality of the leadership previously.
My name is Albert from Germany. Someone of you said is that Serbs look at the Albanians as Serbians, not as enemies on an equal level. So would you say too that there is some racism in the relationship between Serbs and Albanians? And would you say too that there is some racism in the relationship between Albanians and Roma people? And if this would be true, what would it mean for the process of dealing with the past and the present?
Once to a British journalist, the relation of the Serbs toward Albanians is more or less the same as the relation of the so-called cultivated Western Europe towards Sinti, Roma, Gypsies. And it was racism. There was nationalism against Croats or Hungarians or whatever. There was racism against the Albanians. And this is much deeper a problem. And therefore, a solution is not just a political one. And as we have seen, not even a political solution is near for us or for them. But the cultural, the social differences are going to remain for decades, if not centuries. The experience with Roma in European Union, I think, is a very important thing that we have to take into account as an example. And therefore, I really believe that Serbian-Albanian relations, I mean Kosovo-Albanian, are relations that are going to be a burden for this part of the world for decades to come. Even when they find a political solution, even if they one day in 2030 both enter the European Union, if a European Union is going to exist at that time, I do not believe that this is going to be settled. Unfortunately, that's what I see.
Hi, my name is Ikuna Hoppe, over here. Does it sound? I'm an anthropologist, and I would like to ask actually one question and one commentary. The one is on transitional justice, or criminal justice. It seems that everybody here, or in the public, but also that talked, there seems to be like a consensus that transitional justice, it's important, right? That it's very important. And I see it being framed in terms of finding out what happened, finding out what the truth was, that somehow, or at least, in terms of discourse, that's seen as supposed to be, revelatory, right? And I would like to bring in like a Freudian metaphor. It's like you go to a psychoanalyst, you throw up, you feel better, so you found out what happened, and then you can continue, and then you move on. It seems like that kind of metaphor, it's very much imbued in these efforts about transitional justice. And I'd like to play the devil's advocate a little bit here and ask, why is it important? So this is a question that is more like, it's an open one, but it should bring out what the implications are behind this entire push for transitional justice. And it seems to me that finding out the truth also by virtue of, let's say, opening up the archives, right? Opening up the state archives, right? So you basically are taking something that was taken out secretly, and you're making it as a foundation for finding out the truth. So I think it has a lot of more larger global repercussions in terms of transitional justice, right? And this is in terms of totalitarian states, and I think it's a very post-Cold War kind of mechanism for working things out. So this is like the one question. And the second question is relating to the state. So we heard here many metaphors for the state. So we heard weak state, unfinished states, non-functional states, modern states, and so on. And I would like us to think a little bit more beyond the state as just something, just as a thing, as an entity that has state institutions, that has borders, that has prime ministers, and so on. And this goes especially in terms of Kosovo, because when it comes to Kosovo, we hear this, well, here you're starting everything from scratch, right? It's a new state, the new institutions are being built, and hence, the metaphors such as newborn and so on. But is it really, right? I mean, is this really a new state? So you might say that, yes, institutions, they were physically, materially damaged, but the ways in which the people related to the states, the needs and expectations, they didn't cut. I mean, they were not closed off overnight. So they continue, and they were very much shaped from the time under socialist Yugoslavia and so on. So this was a comment. I'll stop it there.
There are still people here, and much more in other parts of former Yugoslavia, who are ready to claim it was better 30 years ago. At least no one was killed, and no one was unemployed. And these are two very important elements that people tend to see. If you come to Germany, you'll find in eastern part of Germany thousands of people claiming that Eastern Germany was better than the situation today. No one would say this in 91. A very simple example, I was there, professor in Berlin, during the fall of the wall. You could buy, a few weeks after the fall of the wall, a little Trabant, it was his German car, for 50 German marks. Now they cost 10,000 euros because they are collector's items from the good old times. Nostalgia is partially a biological problem. We were younger at that time. And because we were younger, we had the idea that the world was better off. And some unimportant, quote unquote, incidents can be forgotten. This is something people forget. How many persons in Europe were victims of the fall of the wall? 500,000 persons were killed. Persons who would not have been killed during the good old Cold War. 35 million persons lost their jobs. 17 million people were forced to leave their homes. This all wouldn't happen if the good old communist wall would still be standing there. I'm not saying that communism was good. I'm saying you have to try to see both sides of the story. How many people are victims of the fall of the wall? How many people are victims of the destroying processes to Yugoslavia? And then the question of state comes. But it is a new state. You're wrong in this respect for a very simple reason. Yugoslavia was not a state. It was a party apparatus. There was no civic idea of a state in Yugoslavia. And that's one of the reasons why Yugoslavia couldn't exist anymore. Yugoslavia could exist only without democracy. The moment we started with democracy, Veton was in a group with me, we tried to combine Yugoslavia and democracy. And it didn't work. So, why? Because Yugoslavia was not a state, but a party apparatus controlling territory of 255,804 square kilometers. And this is the problem. And to build a new state meant from Slovenia to Kosovo, trying to build state as a democratic apparatus, not as a party apparatus. It has failed in many respects, in Slovenia, in Croatia, in Serbia, and in Kosovo. But it is a new beginning. It is not a prolongation of the old state. In most of the cases, for the better, in some of the cases, for the worse. That would be, I think, the answer, trying to take both sides of the equation into account.
I'm Arber Silvani, I'm a culture journalist. Basically, I agree with the idea that some countries don't want to have, or they don't want to deal with the past, because like Mr. Surroi said, they just want to forget everything and let it in the past, and maybe it will disappear itself. But what I wanted to know is, maybe starting from Kosovo perspective, we had, and we still have these problems of culture, like this Catholic churches, and I believe that deeply inside there is a huge problem regarding the dealing with the topic. So I would like to know from the three countries the perspective of like how culture is being involved in this, and because I truly believe, and I'm writing pieces, and I know that we have problems regarding culture, and this is affecting too much in the culture, in the dealing with the past process.
The whole idea in Freud is that you need what he would call Verdrängung, which means putting things down, and you need a lot of energy. To construct a lie means that you need a lot of intelligence. When I was 10 years old, my teacher has told me, stupid people have to say the truth because they're too stupid to lie. And that's something that's very important. You have to organize institutions for lie. We have had in Yugoslavia special institutions to organize the lie about the war 41 to 45. They now start new institutions like this in Croatia, for instance. And it means that you are spending a lot of social energy for something that's really void. And this is the social reason. In Germany, it started in 1959 with a small movie called Wir Wunderkinder, a small satiric movie, which started by showing how people who were successful during the Nazi time suddenly become successful in the Adenauer era, supported by the Marshall Plan Americans and so on, anti-communism and so on and so on and so on. And that was the birth date of something that finished with 68 generation, which made Germany the only state in Europe which in organized way was ready to deal with the past. It's not the case of France, it's not the case of Britain, not to mention the United States. They still can't say that Hiroshima was the biggest war crime in history. In Britain you can't discuss, or in France you can't discuss colonial periods with all the consequences. In Germany you can. And we have now empiric proof. If you compare parts of Europe where people speak German, which means former West Germany, former East Germany, Austria and Switzerland. In former West Germany, it's 3 times less radical right voters than in Eastern Germany, in Austria, and in the Swiss. Because only the Western Germany has really had the way of facing the past in these Freudian terms. And that's, I think, very important for all of us. And this is why I think transitional justice is so important.
I think that we started to build environment for dealing with past. The Hague Tribunal is very important. Legacy of the Hague Tribunal based on facts relating to concrete crimes, concrete victims, perpetrators. Legacy is very important. We can, criticize legal decisions of the Hague Tribunal, but legacy of facts is very important. Also, many civil society initiatives are very important. And what we can expect, if we as a civil society on the regional level succeed to name, to register all victims, to establish facts about all war crimes, it will be the first time in history of Balkan and the world, to prepare facing of the past in proper way. And three of us, we advocate establishment of regional commission who will deal with facts about war crimes, victims and perpetrators. And with facts established by the Hague Tribunal, by domestic courts, I think we have chance to change our culture and to build memory based on names and knowledge about what's happened. What's happened after the Second World War is a very bad experience. It was, I met one man, Serb, from Croatia in '91 in Belgrade. And he started to speak about killing in the Glina, one place in Croatia. And the story about that was, I was familiar, but I didn't know when it's happened. And the whole story was this horrible, He spoke about the church, about 300 of Serbs who were killed, and after 10 days, again, 200 Serbs were killed. And I was listening, and I was, shocked. And I asked him, please tell me the date of massacre. And he told me, I can't remember the date, but it was in 41. Summer 41. Can you imagine? He came from Croatia in '91, and he spoke about 41. And what means, memory without the names, memory without public knowledge, memory without facing the past. And it is very important to face with the past, and our initiative is going in that way.
I may address the question of culture, although I didn't understand the context of the Catholic Church in it, but I think we have a phenomena in these past years in Kosovo of a cultural, almost a cultural diktat, I would say, which has three components. The first one is a culture of historic discontinuity, and it is imposing an understanding of history that starts basically, if possible, in the mandate in which the government is formed, whichever government forms the mandate, with discarding whatever has happened in the past as an objective reality that has produced some of these here. And this is an abrupt, forceful imposition of the notion of history. The second, also imposition in terms of culture, is that we come from a culture of destruction as a society, because in the past 20 years we have been trying to destroy an imposed reality upon us. We have tried to, with whatever forces we had, to confront occupation, and confront occupation by destroying that occupation. And therefore, we have, I think, become much better at destroying than at constructing. And that is one of the big problems that we have, which is to leave our collective notion of our capability to destroy. And the third part of that same notion is that the political elites that have, in one way or the other, are now heading the society, come from a culture of clandestinity. And clandestinity is an institution in itself. It does not respect the institutions of a democracy. And so, if you listen to the communication, ULEX has been intercepting our government's conversation. And I'm not speaking at the level of language that some of these people use, which is rather poor. But the level of communication shows a parallel society, which these people are accustomed to living. They are accustomed to living in a clandestine group in which they communicate their needs in the way they communicate them, disregarding the institutions of which they are part. So to understand why this government does so, you have to understand that they come from a clandestine past, and that they have simply continued with that clandestine past and will continue doing so because that's how they have grown up, and that's how they think they will have to finish their careers. These three components of my understanding of culture today is actually trying to create a format of life that is to a great extent undemocratic, to a great extent anti-cultural, if you will, because it is focused on just one embryo, and its needs will be to perpetuate itself, because this is what clandestine societies and clandestine groups try to do. They do not try to go into the open, but try to keep their clandestinity or their form as a second option in case the first option fails.
Hi, my name is Jan Bruch. I'm a history student at the University of Edinburgh. Earlier, Mr. Surroi said that the past is not a priority in this process because of all the economic crimes and the economic dimension of all that. And I was wondering, how can there be a process of reconciliation in the present if we're diverging about the past? And I was wondering whether we can see history as a purely scientific and unbiased discipline, as something that can help in the process. Not the history that we've talked about, the state-controlled history or state-commissioned history, but independent, scientific, unbiased research. Can that help in the process?
Well, what I said was that there's a fierce competition between the past and the present. And I think what we need to do is integrate the need to deal with the past as a choice for the present or a choice for the future. And that basically means what Nataša is doing and what we support, which is we need to deal with the past in such a way as to have generations understand the destruction of war and the evil that drives it, and the social and economic conditions that do so. And the context in which this is being done. And now we need to do so not because of the past per se, but because of the future. And that's what I'm, in this fierce competition between past and present, we need to devise the need to address the past as a need for the present and for the future in itself. So there's an added value to dealing with the past in such a way. And the second point is, I don't think history is ever written. I think history is being continuously written. And I think what we need to do is to create conditions that the sources for writing of history remain as open as possible. And this is what people like Nataša have been doing in the past 20 years in very adverse conditions. You know, imagine the 90s and Milosevic's regime and you know, the Fund for Humanitarian Law trying to develop a library of documentation, exactly having in mind this, that one day this will be over. We will need to sit around it and understand what happened to us.
Thank you, Ms. Kandić. Professor Puhovski, final words, thoughts?
I think we have finally come with this question to the point. The point is that on the one hand, we have had a very successful reconciliation processes based on forgetting the past. European Union is the best example. The whole idea of European Union was to bury the past and start from the new economic point of view and then go as far as we can in political terms. On the other hand, we have a very nice passage thousands of years ago in the Homer's Iliad, where the narrator says, it is not true that the past is behind us and the future in front of us, because we see the past. And what we see is in front of us. So we are going backwards in the future. And the only orientation we can have is in seeing the past. And this is why past is important, because this is the only orientation. The question is now, of course, how do we gather our knowledge about the past? And we have a lot of nationalistic mythologies, we have a lot of wrong interpretations of past in terms of self-service store, taking from the past what we like, which is going to show our case, our nation in good light, and leaving everything else for the others. Or we try to deal with the facts, accepting that, quote unquote, our guys could also have been the bad guys. And this is the whole point, I think.
Yeah, what is important, if we want to build a future, we cannot forget the past. We cannot forget the crimes committed. We cannot say now we are going to build a future and past is past. Past is part of our future and we cannot forget. It means that facts about the past are very important. It's only way to escape in a recurrence of the crimes in our Balkan situation.
Thank you very much, distinguished panelists, for your contribution. Ms. Kandić, Professor Puhovski, Mr. Surroi, and you in the audience, thank you very much for being in such a large number here with us.